I'm Sharon Alterman, and I'm here with Jack Miller, and we're having an oral history interview as part of the Jewish Federation series of oral history interviews. Today, we're in the Jewish Federation building. It is December the 10th. And Jack, do I have your permission to utilize whatever your insights and thoughts may be in the future for either educational or research purposes?
You have. They may not be worth much, but you
Well,
can
thank
use
you.
them.
I bet they are. Let's start at the very beginning. I'd like to know a little bit about your childhood. First of all, where were you born?
I was born actually in Baltimore, Maryland, because that's where my mother and father landed when they came from Russia. So I was born there. But I came to Detroit when I was 2 years old. So for the next almost 90 years, I was a Detroiter.
And what are your earliest recollections of living in the city of Detroit?
Well, I brought with me, Sharon, a letter that I wrote to my friends and law partners on my 90th birthday. And I'm going to deliver that to you. And that really, in a dozen or so pages, tells the story of my early childhood in Detroit. But I do remember going back to when I was 3 or 4 years old. I do remember a lot of those early days because I think I matured more quickly than most kids. I had to, because when I was 6 years old, my mother separated from my father, and I was more or less almost on my own even at that early age. And so I matured rather quickly. I stayed in Detroit. My mother went off to New York with my brother and sister, and he and I were roommates in rented rooms. The first one was a garret.
Where did you live? What neighborhood?
On Oakland and Cameron, in that area.
And what was that neighborhood like in those days?
Little wooden houses. The house that my father and I roomed with was a tiny 2-bedroom house which had a garret, which was on the attic, so small that when my father came to go to bed, he'd have to bend to get into the room. Had a tiny little staircase up there, and I slept in a cot in that room. And that's the kind of housing it was, old pre-World War I housing. And the landlady, because I was kind of young at that point, 6, 7 years old, provided me with food, not him. Mine came with room and board. But by the time I was 8 and a half, we moved, and then we were, I was a restaurant eater. So I matured very early.
What school did you go to in those days?
Oh, Moore School, Brightmeyer, that was in that neighborhood, and later on Northern High School, and then Central.
Were you involved in any activities as a youth, like at the Hannah Schloss? Or?
No, because my mother was an avowed communist. Matter of fact, that was one of the reasons for the separation divorce. She became very active, and she was a woman's liber. And so I was not involved in Jewish things. I was more or less involved in the communist movement when she was before she left Detroit. I remember going to St. Aubin to a place called the House of Masses. That was when I was 5 or 6 years old, and I was in a play called King Hunger, and I was King Hunger. That play.
So
it was obviously a communist activity that was against capitalism. That was a strange beginning for a guy who became a capitalist of the first order in my later years. But all through that early childhood and through college, I was a very radical-minded person. Religion was a cocaine for the masses, so I never really became active in any religious activity until I got married. That was the first time I was ever in a synagogue when I got married. But I was always Jewish. There's no doubt about it. I was a secular Jew right from the very beginning, but not a religious or active in Jewish activities.
That's what I was going to ask you. What did you know about your Jewish identity?
Very little, because it was mostly political, and as I say, I never got into a Jewish center or into a Jewish activity. It was always a radical activity. Even in college, when I went to City College, I was one of the editors of a off-campus newspaper, which tore at all of the traditions at City College at the time. We railed against the political scientist teachers that we had in my magazine that we put out called Hyde Park, no longer in existence, but I wrote for that, and of course it was tearing down everything that was traditional.
Did you keep any of those writings?
No. They were done on mimeograph paper. We got a hold of an old mimeograph instrument, and it was always a race between us and the Gas House Gang. The Gas House Gang was football players who formed an organization, and one of their activities was to try to intercept our weekly publications and tear them up if they could get a hold of them. No, that was the interlude. The funny thing is that my mother in later years became a Republican, and of course I saw the error of my ways in following and disassociating myself from the Russian experiment, which turned out to be a disaster for the proletariat, even though they espoused themselves to be the saviors. So
When did you disassociate?
Oh, that was after I got out of law school, and I saw what was happening in Russia and saw what was happening to Jews in the world, and then I became active in Jewish affairs, and I never joined the Lawyers Guild, which was the radical lawyers movement of that day, because I'd already matured to the point that I recognized that capitalism and not communism was the savior of the world.
But all through, even into law school, you had those kind of tendencies.
So I was radical,
You mentioned City College. Was that your undergrad training?
2 years of City College, and then I went to Ann Arbor and got my lit degree there and my law degree at University of Michigan.
How did you do it? Because you talked about your background that was really very modest. Who helped you get into the university? And how
I
did you-
borrowed money. I borrowed all of my tuition, and in later years paid it back, as a matter of fact. And tuition was very modest. And I lived very modestly. I couldn't get into I didn't have the money to get in the Lawyers Club, so I lived in rooming houses, and getting enough to eat at times was a problem. I was kind of famous at the University of Michigan because I found a way to eat a lot without paying for it. I used to go to the Michigan Union, which had a cafeteria down in the basement. And I could get a full meal for the price of a bowl of soup.
How?
And I did that quite frequently, and the guys behind the counter knew it. I would order a bowl of soup, and there was always lots of lemons for those who ordered fish. Well, I didn't have enough money to pay for the fish. I ordered a bowl of soup, lots of lemons, and then I would go to the table and join the other guys who had full meals. I would take a bottle of ketchup and I would convert the bowl of soup to ketchup soup. And then I would make lemonade with lots of sugar and use all those lemons that I had, and I'd make lemonade. And so I got my sugar, I got my vegetable with tomato ketchup, and I got soup.
You were resourceful.
So that's the way I ate lots of times that way.
Did you work it out when you were?
Yes, oh sure, I had jobs all the time through high school and through college.
What sort of work?
Helping out I worked for the C.F. Smith Company, which was a small grocery chain after school. And there I found ways to supplement my food intake. One of the ways, I'd stock the shelves when I was in high school. And one of the things they had was I found after a while, was jars of mayonnaise with pickle relish in them, sandwich spread. And I was able, when the boss was not looking, to open those, run my finger horizontally over a jar or two or three, and then reseal them. And so I got my sandwich spread, and there was always a loaf of stale bread that the boss was going to throw out anyway. So I did a lot of eating in my grocery jobs. I worked in fruit and vegetable stands, and there the boss didn't care if I took an apple or an orange, so I got my fruits and vegetables there. So money was very short. Didn't bother me. I never really felt poor. I just had to be resourceful, but it never disturbed me that I was poor. But of course, I grew up in the Depression days, and everybody was poor then. If you read, I brought with me 3 books that I've written in my later years, and one of them, the 3rd book, has a story of the Depression days. And I'm going to leave that with you, Sharon. And it'll tell you how things were during those years from 1930 through 1940, those 10 years. And that's when I was growing up. And everybody had no money. Even rich people were poor. So I didn't feel much different than some of my so-called rich friends. They had cars and I didn't. That was the only difference.
So you had developed relationships with
Yes,
people at
yes.
Michigan. Was there
Yeah.
anybody that mentored you there on the faculty?
No. You never got close to professors. They were gods. And I never met with a professor except in class. I was afraid to, actually. They kept to themselves in those days. Today you can meet and talk to professors, but not in those days. You stood in awe of them, and they kept their distance. I got my job with Honigman as a result of a letter that Mr. Honigman got from one of my law professors in Ann Arbor that I didn't know about. And I didn't think he knew. Well, I was popular in his class because I happened to be very good in reciting. And especially in his class because he taught in a mysterious way. If he called on 2 or 3 of the students and didn't get the answer he wanted, he would quite frequently call on me, and I had a knack of knowing what he wanted, even though it was not necessarily the thing that was in the book. And he bumped into Honigman in my senior year in law school, and Honigman said he was looking for a young lawyer, to be his first employee. And Edgar Noble Durfee, that was the professor, wrote a letter, 2-page letter, about me to Honigman. And it was a result of that letter that Honigman hired me a year later after he got that letter. And I didn't know about the letter until about a year before Jason died. He was cleaning out his files, and he found that letter and gave it to me. He said, "You ought to have this letter." And it was very flattering. And I didn't dream that Professor Durfee would take that much note, not only to bother, but to actually write a very complimentary letter, which is now hanging in my office.
What year was that you joined?
I graduated in 1935 and was very lucky to get a job clerking for Judge Henry M. Butzel, who was then the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court. It was the only job that was available. While I was near the top of my class, I could not get a job with any of the large law firms because they didn't hire Jews. And the only job that I was fortunately able to get was clerking for Henry Butzel for a year. And it was during that year that Honigman, after having that letter in his possession for several months, called me and hired me on the spot.
When you worked for the judge, was that the time when you started to learn about the Jewish community?
Yes, yes. You asked me whether I had any mentors. It was Henry M. Butzel that was my mentor. He taught me most everything that I knew, needed to know to mature. He was magnificent. And, it's a funny thing, Sharon, but today people don't know about Henry and Fred Butzel. In my day, they were the Max Fischers of the community. They were not only powerful in the legal community, but in the Jewish community. They were it. They gave of themselves and of their money. If there was any important decisions to be made in the Jewish community in those days, it would be the 2 Butzel brothers, those 2 who decided and who were involved. And Henry taught me about life and wealth and importance. One of the things he did was he would take me down to the vaults because he was trustee of a number of wealthy individuals of their estates, and I clipped coupons down in the vault. Never seen a bonds or wealth in my background. So he taught me about life, taught me about philosophy, and of course the importance of Judaism, particularly of the secular Jewish community. He was not religious either. He belonged to Temple Bethel, but he really was not involved in orthodoxy in any fashion. Matter of fact, he used to tease because his brother Fred was the one that wrote the checks to the Orthodox community. And I remember once he came back from lunch laughing because he had had lunch with Fred Butzel, and they got to the subject, his brother, and they got to the subject of orthodoxy. And Henry told me, he said to Fred, Fred, I don't know why you continue to give money to those collectors, he called them Chicago detectives. That was the nickname for the Jews who were raising money for Orthodox. They all had long beards, and they had a particular approach that Henry didn't really pay much attention to. And he said, I don't know why you continue to support those Chicago detectives. Don't you know that when they come to you and you give them a dollar or $5 or $100, half of that goes to the driver who drives them around, and a quarter of that goes to the collector, and maybe a quarter goes to the real recipients of that contribution. Don't you know that? That guy that I sent you today that knocked on my door first, couldn't you see that he was a typical Chicago detective? And Fred said to Henry, yes, he said, I know that, but did you look at his shoes? And that told how Fred's relationship was to philanthropy. He looked at their shoes, Henry didn't.
What were the major things that you remember about Fred and his involvement in the community?
Fred was involved in not only the Jewish community, but in the Gentile community as well, and was a spokesman for the Jews in the Gentile world. He was a gem, and his brother supported him. But Fred was more active in the day-to-day Jewish community. And he did philanthropy on a large scale and on a one-to-one scale. My wife, for example, was a very fine pianist, and when she was young was a winner of the Grinnell piano competition, but didn't have enough money to take lessons from Benedson Netzorg, who was one of the important teachers in the community. And Fred Butzel paid her fees to Benedson Netzorg, and did it with, I don't think she made a direct contact, but he wanted to make sure that if there was kids that needed piano lessons and were talented and needed support, he was available. And I think my recollection is that Netzer went directly to Fred to get his fees so he could teach Jeanette piano.
Was he a great music lover?
Yes, he loved music. He was magnificent. He was active politically. He was not much of a lawyer, but fortunately he didn't have to be. His brother, who was the founder of Butzel, Levin and Winston, a very important law firm in Detroit, and who ascended to the Michigan Supreme Court, and who was very active nationally in the law, covered that part of their activity.
You mentioned your wife. How did you meet?
We met in high school, Central High School, and it was pretty clear almost from the beginning that that was going to be a permanent relationship. I didn't think I'd get married at a young age, like 22. I thought 40 or 50 would be a right age to get married, but she had other ideas. But I did know that we were hooked up, and she was introduced to me by one of the girls at Central who said, "Do you know Jack Miller?" And she said, "No." "Well, he's the one that wears two colored socks. I'd wear one black and one green because I was colorblind, and I was my own housekeeper. And quite frequently I would wear mismatching socks or whatever happened to be in the drawer. And that's how we met, and it was a love at first sight. I never had another girlfriend.
Socks match today.
Yeah,
Your
they
socks
match, yeah.
today.
Well, because my housekeeper puts them together and puts them in one drawer for brown and one drawer for blue.
So what year did you get married?
1936. I got married a day before I graduated from law school, and fortunately had a job with Butzel. When I interviewed with Butzel, which was around April of that year, I knew then that I was going to get married in June, come hell or high water, because Jeanette had made that decision. And when I left my interview session with Henry Butzel, he said to me, "By the way, Jack, you're not married, are you?" I said, "No, sir." He says, "You're not getting married, are you?" And I fudged. I kind of said no. He said, "Because if you were married or going to get married, I would not hire you. I have a very strong feeling that young lawyers have enough trouble, especially young Jewish lawyers, in making their way without having the burden of marriage. And so I would not hire anybody to clerk for me who's either married or going to get married." And I said, "Well, I'm not married," which was true. And so we kept our marriage secret from Butzel. And as a matter of fact, that was a strain. Jeanette could not call me at work, even though because Butzel could hear me. I had a little cubbyhole next to his office. But he could hear me if I talked to my wife. And as a matter of fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, because, Sharon, it was, I would say September, October of the 1 year that I was clerking for Butzel. And I was very nervous. And I went to see Fred Butzel, and I told him the truth, that I was married, that Judge Butzel, his brother, did not know it, and I didn't know what to do about living that lie. And Fred said, "Well, I'll see if I can help you out." That very day, he had lunch with his brother. Henry had an office in Detroit next to Fred Butzel's office. And when he wasn't sitting in Lansing, he would be in that office. And when he was in that office, he had lunch almost daily with his brother Fred. Well, that very day, they had lunch. I'd say it was September, October. I'd started with Butzel in June. Butzel came back from that lunch, sat down, and I was in the other little room scribbling away on my research when I heard Butzel call, "Jack?" I said, "Yes, sir," and I hopped into the office, and he had bushy eyebrows. He was you were afraid of Butzel. Oh, yes, he was a very strong, not smiling kind of person, although he could smile when he wanted to. I came in and he said, "Jack?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Are you married?" And I swallowed and I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, why didn't you tell me?" He said, "You can't get along on $80 a month. I'm giving you another $20 a month raise retroactively." And he did.
You must have been quite a guy for that to happen.
Yeah. And so that ended the living the lie.
And then you went with Honigman the very next year?
Yes. In May of the next year, at the end of my first full year with him, I went to Honigman. And that was my first and only job. I worked for, as an employee of Jason's for about 8 years. And then at the end of that 8-year period, he announced one day that it's Honigman and Miller, that's the firm name, and we're equal partners, which was shocking to me because all of the business was his. He owned it, and I never dreamt that he would be that generous, but he was.
Well, obviously, you were good at what you did.
I was good at what I did, but he was also a little different than most lawyers in those days. That still, don't forget, that was still the Depression era, and most lawyers adopted the attitude, senior lawyers, that they were going to use young lawyers, abuse them, and when they became too expensive to keep, they would get rid of them and hire new young lawyers. That was the traditional way of running a law office, and Honigman didn't believe in that, nor did I, of course.
How old was Jason at the time when he brought you in?
He was born in 1904, and I was born in 1912. There was an 8-year difference.
So when did you become involved as a community leader? Because your leadership goes way back too.
I think it happened very quickly because Butzel, who was my mentor, was active in the community. Honigman was not. Honigman was not. He was a generous donor, but he never really got involved. It stemmed from my association with Henry Butzel. He was sort of my idol, as was Honigman. The two of them really had the largest, by far the largest impression on my entire life. Honigman as a pure lawyer was a genius in the law, and Butzel because of the family and their position in the Jewish community. So they got me started on that.
What were some
You
of the
couldn't
first...
you couldn't leave the Butzel activity without becoming an important secular Jew. It was just.
It was a given.
It was a given, yeah.
What were some of the first things that you got involved in as a community leader?
The Allied Jewish campaign, I got involved in that right from the very beginning. And I went through the agencies. Eventually ended up, the important agency was the United Jewish Charities and the Jewish Community Center. But I did all the others.
You were on Sinai's board.
Yes, I was on
JBS,
Sinai. Yes, I was on I was on all those boards, but the important activity were those two, the United Jewish Charities and the Jewish Center. Although at Sinai I was pretty active. I was on their, very active on their risk management committee, which was the guts of their activity, evaluating claims made against the hospital. And there I spent a lot of time in activity.
So you were part of the decision-making process, and I know that at the center, during your tenure, there were many important decisions made. We talked about the Shabbat closing.
Yes, during my presidency, just before it and certainly afterwards, there were two important problems that arose. One was the decision to open the Jewish Center, which was then located on Myers and Myers Road, to open the center for Sabbath activity. And the second big problem during my presidency was the issue of whether or not we should open the membership to non-Jews. And there was a strong movement towards opening centers to non-Jews, especially nationally. and then it grew in our community too. And so I fought that battle and prevailed on the Sabbath opening. That was a tough one. When we decided to open the Center for Sabbath Activity, a group of guys joined in, I must say, by the Reformed rabbis as well, which kind of startled me, that opposed the opening of the center on the Sabbath. And as I wrote in the letter, which I'll give you, I didn't become the president of the Jewish Center to preside over its liquidation, and so I fought the activities of the rabbis, joined in by a number of lay people as well. Abe Castle, who was an Orthodox Jew, was one of the in the forefront of the move to keep the center closed on the Sabbath. And most of us at the center opposed that view. Obviously, we conceded that we shouldn't have competition that went on, but for quiet activity at the center, study at the center, use of the facilities for exercise, not competition, we thought that was an appropriate use of it. We fought that battle. As a matter of fact, the litigation commenced. I bring with me a copy of that lawsuit that somebody started to enjoin the Jewish Center from being used on the Sabbath. We won that litigation, and I brought with me the decision. And we finally compromised. And I must say that the one that helped us the most in as far as the rabbinate was concerned, beside a number of lay people, was Rabbi Jacob Siegel. He dealt directly with the rabbinate, and we eventually ended up with a compromise opening. We kept it open, agreed that we would not have competition, we wouldn't have games. You could swim in the swimming pool, but you couldn't have races, and so we agreed to that. We agreed that we could operate the hot room, but we couldn't operate the schwitz. Schwitz.
What was the difference?
One was wet and the other was dry. We could operate the dry, but because the schwitz made you sweat or whatever, the rabbinate prevailed on that. So we closed the sweat room, but we could operate the dry heat. And they finally capped that off, the compromise, by putting a string around the entire perimeter of the Jewish Center. I forget what that's called. An arrow. Yes. Yeah. They did that. I put an actual string around, and now the center still is open.
Did they gain membership at that time after that decision was made? Or?
The open membership problem came in a little later, a couple years later, when there was a move nationally, and it took effect locally to open the membership. I opposed it, and I prevailed. And one of the letters that I wrote, you'll see in my file, I think, was very effectual. certainly nationally, if not otherwise. But
What were your reasons?
well, I felt that to open the membership to non-Jews posed a problem of this kind, that if a majority of the members of the Jewish Center became non-Jewish, the center would obviously lose its Jewish importance, and should. If for example, a majority of the members of this Jewish Center belonged to the Islamic race, you would expect that the programming and the activity would become Islamic, and it would no longer be a Jewish center. Now, you could play games and still call it a Jewish center, maybe, but it would lose its Jewish identity. And I said that it was important for us to keep our identity, that it didn't offend. There was it didn't offend the separation of church and state for our Jewish values and culture to be housed in a geographical separate house where we could preserve our difference. And it was important to preserve our difference. And to go through shams of having special memberships or other things would only cover up the fact that we should openly declare that we want this house to be a house where Jewish values, culture, and language is emphasized, and to preserve that, and not to play games. So that was the thrust of my argument. I don't know that I prevailed. I think today we have non-Jews.
Yes.
We have open memberships, don't we? So I eventually lost out. That was 1961. 40 years later, they've decided otherwise.
It'll be interesting to watch
Yep.
progression to see
Yep.
what happens.
Yeah.
But by this point, did you have an affiliation with a Jewish with a temple or a synagogue, or were you still very secular?
Yeah, I was still very secular. I never really, while I did join Temple Israel, I did it because I wanted to expose my kids to something I never was exposed to, and that is a religious background. And if it took, it was fine with me, and if it didn't take, it was fine with me.
So
I really never became a religious Jew, even to this day. Although my mother, who indoctrinated me with that position, in the last years of her life, said that she was starting to believe in God. That was because she was getting near her Maker, and I think she thought maybe she ought to cover all of her bases. But even though I'm getting nearer my God, I haven't changed my attitude on being non-religious.
But in terms of your family, there's
No, in terms of my family, one took and the other didn't. My youngest son is an Orthodox Jew. My oldest son is a secular Jew, like me.
What about your ties to Israel? Did you visit there often?
Yes, I was in Israel on a mission, I was chairman of a mission in 1961. Yes, I became a Zionist early on, and I believe in it, and have supported it.
What were your recollections from that early trip of the country?
Oh, I loved it. I loved the Jews that were there, and again, because of my background, I mingled with and dealt almost solely with secular Jews. I never, I think only in all my trips there, I think I only went to Mea Shearim once, and I was turned off by the extreme orthodoxy of Mea Shearim. Didn't like it, felt it was against the best interest of Israel, but that's from my particular attitude and bent. I may be, because I could be wrong about that, but my background turns me off to the tenets of orthodoxy, even though my son, whom I love dearly, is an Orthodox Jew. But, on Shabbos, when I'm with him, I don't make fun of it in his presence. But outside of his presence, I still don't like it, don't believe in it.
Do you have any family living in Israel? Your grandchildren?
Yes, I have this son that I mentioned has a son, Zachary, who has made Aliyah to Israel, just got his MBA from Northwestern University, Kellogg School of Business School, and probably will make his life in Israel. He got 4 kids, and if he gets a job, which he is hopeful of in Israel, will probably
Is this a
spend
recent
his
move
life.
for him?
Yeah,
Oh, I see.
that was a year ago.
I see. What do you think of the American Jewish support of Israel at this time? Do you think it's as strong as ever?
Yes, yes. Oh, yes. The problems are horrific, but no, I don't think there's been any diminution in the relationship between our American Jews and the Jews in Israel. I think it's as strong as ever, and the Jews will prevail. They're not moving.
What do you think the challenges of our community are, in this Detroit Jewish community, from your long-term perspective?
Oh, I think there are always going to be problems. That's part of our heritage. And the same as Shylock had his problems in Shakespearean times, the different problems. We have Jewish problems today that are ominous and difficult, but I think we're going to manage to handle them. My mother, when she left Russia, talked to us at length about the pogroms, and that was a Jewish fear in those days, the pogroms in Russia. Well, we didn't have pogroms during my lifetime, but we had anti-Semitism. I couldn't get a job in any non-Jewish law firm, even though on the basis of my grades in law school, I should have been able to get into any law firm. I couldn't. And we've passed that by. In my day, you couldn't, a Jewish lawyer couldn't represent a public utility company. Well, we were a Jewish law firm and we represent Detroit Edison. That was unheard of in my day, to think that a Jewish law firm would represent a major public utility. We've overcome that. We got new problems now. Intermarriage is one of them. Is that going to mean that we're losing our Jews? A little bit. Maybe we're we're losing some religious Jews, not necessarily secular Jews, though. I've got grandchildren now who are not religious Jews, but they're secular Jews. And they celebrate Hanukkah and Yom Kippur and all the rest of it. And I've got some Orthodox young grandchildren that are Orthodox who are going to make up for the others. I think Judaism is going to survive.
You've got that same optimism.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm optimistic. Yeah, I'm optimistic. All right. I have some of my partners who should be optimistic who are not. But that's been my attitude towards life all the way through. The glass has always been half full, never half empty. And I've had a great ride, 91, and still playing tennis, and enjoying life, even though I've had lots of tough goes. I lost a son when he was in his 30s. That might have broken up a marriage. Quite often that does. There was Jeanette and I just weathered that storm. Lots of times you don't, because we're both optimistic. It's a great way to handle life, especially in the golden years. You have to be optimistic then. It's not a time for sissies.
We're almost done. This has been a beautiful hour with you.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you would like to discuss that perhaps we didn't touch upon? So we can go into the next tape.
No, I think you've covered. I'd be glad to leave with you my three stories. Now, they're and they do tell. While they're fictional, they really have part of my life in there, and I think people who read them understand that. And I think it's a good thing maybe for the Historical Society to have in there.
We'll be proud to keep them.
Yeah.
We will. 'Cause I've read
And
them
especially the dirty parts, eh?
Okay. And one last thing. You've had a wonderful life, and you talked about all your accomplishments. Is there anything that stands out about the rest that you take supreme pride in?
Yeah, if I were to leave a message for people, because of my background in domestic relations, where I spent a lot of time practicing in that field, I only hope that I could be around to counsel people to stay in their marriages. It's become so easy to get divorced that divorces occur with great frequency in situations where they shouldn't happen. It's been made easy to walk out on each other, and it does so much damage that if the marriage is tolerable, people ought to work at keeping their marriages and not walk out of them, because walking out of a fairly good marriage is a terrible mistake. And I would venture to say that many of the divorces that I handled shouldn't have occurred if people had only been willing or motivated to work at staying in it, because there's so many bad things happen when you get divorced,